how did you kind of end up where you're at with your YouTube channel? How did you kind of like
Yeah,
where did
okay.
this all start?
So yeah, okay, so I'll give you the the short version. Okay, so basically, the story I always tell. It's interesting, right? Because people ask me this question, and I sort of have this sort of stock story I tell, and I kind of wonder sometimes, like, oh, it's the same story every time. Is this really what happened? Who knows? But it's nevertheless a story I sort of have, which is which is basically, as a teenager, I, was experiencing some sort of existential depression. What's the point of life? That sort of thing. Probably came from some psychological issues in my upbringing, but also perhaps from, some kind of native interest in this sort of thing, even from being a little kid, like a sense of, wonder and a sense of there must be something more, essentially. Probably, I think I had that. I was always kind of a little bit religious as a little kid, and then I became sort of an atheist as a teenager, and then I had this sort of existential depression that I'm talking about. And I grew up in a Hindu household, but when I would ask complicated questions about philosophy, my relatives couldn't really answer. And not only could my relatives not answer, but I remember, for example, I don't know, going with the relative to one of her teachers, and I asked some question like, oh, if there's karma and rebirth, then what happened in our very first life? What was the karma then? Which is like
Hmm.
it's a very valid question, really, actually, even though it's a little
Hmm.
kid question, it's also a valid question. And he said something like, and it might have been a translation problem, frankly, I think now, but he said something like, such questions should not be asked, or something like that. And I was
Okay.
like, okay, well, okay, I guess there are no answers here. But when I was a teenager, what happened is there was a Hindu monk who was coming to the U.S. for the first time, and he wanted basically, was my extended family knew him, and they asked him to stay with my at my house basically for a few weeks. And so when he was there, I started talking to him, and I started asking him some of these questions. And unlike the others, he actually could engage in a dialogue. And
Mm.
so I started just like hammering him with question after question after question. We just got really, really into this dialogue. Um, and that sort of, he came back actually year after year for a few weeks at a time, and we would just pretty much the entire time just talk. And through him, I sort of started to understand there actually were, there's a very sophisticated philosophical system behind, what I currently teach, which is essentially a contemporary version of Vedanta. And I was sort of persuaded by that system. And so through high school, I sort of studied informally, very informally, through these dialogues with him. And then I sort of thought I understood it. Didn't understand it really. I understood, I would say, the rudiments of it. I understood the big picture of it, sort of, but I didn't really fully get it. Going into college, I was like, okay, well, I kind of know I want this self-realization or enlightenment thing, and I thought I knew exactly what it would take to get it. And I had all these, I had all these tasks that I wanted to set myself. I wanted to meditate. I wanted to, eat right and sleep right, and all these things that people recommend that you do. But very quickly into my college experience, I discovered that I actually was finding some kind of psychological barrier to doing those things. Like, I didn't want to do them. Like, I
Hmm.
wanted to do them, but I didn't want to do them. This is a paradox. Like, I thought I wanted this, but then I found myself not motivated to do these things.
Mm.
So what's the problem? So I thought it was a matter of procrastination. Like, I started reading all these books about procrastination. A lot of people do. Procrastination is not what procrastination seems to be, actually. And this then kicked off, a long psychological journey for me, which took another decade essentially. I stayed with the spiritual during that time, but it sort of went in and out of focus and to and from the foreground. But meanwhile, I sort of had to sort of discover a lot of things about myself, about things I'd been sort of, not dealing with in terms of my, past and upbringing and stuff like that. I did a bunch of therapy, psychoanalysis, which I'm a big proponent of. In particular, it was very, very helpful. But so anyway, so that took essentially the next, I don't know, 10, 12 years beyond that point or more. But even in college, even when I was sort of in that initial phase, I did encounter Ramana Maharishi, and I already had, a reasonable intellectual understanding of Vedanta. And when I came upon Ramana Maharishi, I knew he was special immediately. I immediately felt like, oh, he knows what he's talking about. There's something very deep and profound here. But I didn't fully understand him, and and I knew that as well. So after, I'm glossing over this long psychological journey of the next 12 years, 12, yeah, really, yeah, 12, 13 years, something like that. Anyway, I was asked at that point, and again, I'd stayed with Vedanta and the spiritual more or less in various ways, and my understanding was increasing over time as I was sort of undoing these various knots in my own psyche and things I'd been dishonest with myself about and stuff like that. But I was sort of asked at a certain point to teach this or really lead this kind of reading group on Hindu scripture with just a few interested people. And I said, okay, sure. And somehow I thought, oh, maybe let me try Ramana Maharishi again. And this time when I revisited it, whatever, 13 years later, whatever, something like that, I was reading it. I was like, oh my God, I actually understand this much, much better. It's far clearer. And of course, I had been the one who had changed in the meantime. So then that sort of struck off this period for me of I got really into Ramana Maharishi, and I really started to practice what he was recommending for about a year or so. And after about a year, I would say that for lack of a better word, clarity dawned. Complete clarity dawned, um, and at that point, I decided to start to teach. So that was probably about late 2017, something like that.
Mm.
And so, yeah. And then, then it was a matter of trying to figure out, well, how best to reach out to people. I mean, truth be told, I'm a terrible marketer. Not really my stuff. There are probably psychological issues there too, I'm no doubt. But I decided, let me just start putting some stuff out, some videos. I put out a couple books. And then I basically, mostly right now, I don't know if this is going to continue to be my main focus in the long run, but at least for the moment, I mainly work with people one-on-one. And I do a little bit of group stuff here and there. I know it's different than a lot of other teachers who have, lots of retreats and satsangs, things like that. And I feel like maybe I should have more of that, but I don't as of the moment. But maybe I will. But yeah, but I have had a lot of really wonderful students, and they're very, very interesting people, and and it's been a blessing to work with them and help them, and so that's what it's been like essentially over the last couple of years now.
That's awesome, man. So when these students come to you, what do they want out of your teachings? Would you say what are they seeking when they come to you?
The students who, at least, so there, I think there are some differences, but basically the students with whom I think I'm the best match are looking, for lack of a better word, for realization, and they often are people who already have had some background in non-duality, and who maybe have encountered other teachers, probably have encountered Ramana Maharishi, and maybe have experimented with some kind of meditation at some point, but they're kind of a little confused, and they want some guidance, and they want to understand, like, how do I actually kind of make it to the quote unquote end of this process, and understanding what that entails and what it means and what it takes, and working through the obstacles in between. Yeah, that's basically what happens. Now, I mean, there are people with whom I'm not as good a match, who are a different sort of points on the process. Like, for example, there might be people who have, very, very strong psychological obstacles. I'm a huge proponent of psychoanalysis in particular. And I do tell some of my students, even some of my students who are with me and who continue to be with me, go get therapy. That would be helpful for you. And some of them take my advice, some of them don't. But there are people for whom, for example, they really just can't proceed without it, actually. And they kind of fall away because they have various essentially unconscious obstacles to the spiritual search within themselves that prevent them from being fully motivated, essentially, to give it their all. And so those people, for example, end up falling away, or might be other people who are more interested in something very, let's say something very, very secular, right? Like they have somehow thought about meditation and they just think, oh, meditation, but they're not really interested in the spiritual quest per se, And I think I'm not probably usually not always, but usually not the best match for those people, because there's inevitably a strong spiritual component. It's not just relaxation, not just meditation. There's a spiritual component. Um, so there's different sort of people, different sort of things that people are seeking, some of whom are not as good a match. But I think the people who are good a match are people who are looking essentially for ultimate truth, or the end of quote unquote suffering, and for whom a bell has already been rung in them, such that they kind of are attracted to non-duality as the means to that, and that they already are kind of more or less relatively have some faith in that process, maybe not complete faith, but some faith. Yeah. So I think that's who I usually tend to work best with.
Mm. So yeah, you're just kind of guide them along, kind of like helping people along the path.
Yeah, people are trying to understand, right? I mean, there's issues of understanding, issues of what is the path all about, questions about all kinds of questions, about the philosophy, the metaphysics. There's part of that. I mean, that intersects with questions about the practice, and questions about how to evaluate the progress, how to deal with obstacles. That's most of it, right? That's most of it. And then I think anything else. That's probably 98% of what we do, right? And then so troubleshooting being a kind of motivation and pointing, pushing, that sort of thing. Yeah.
So how do you guide somebody to a direct realization of the quote unquote ultimate truth with your words when the ultimate truth goes beyond words?
Absolutely. So the answer is it's primarily through the recommendation of practice. So what Ramana Maharshi says, this is again my interpretation of him, obviously, is words are essentially there to get you to look within. The words themselves can't communicate the truth. What they can get you to do is get you to look within. And the two main methods, which are really ultimately the same method actually, but they're slightly different views from Maharishi's standpoint, are self-inquiry and surrender. And both of those methods are essentially recommendations to turn the attention away from the changeable objects of experience. When you turn your attention away from the changeable objects of experience, when you try to sift away the changeable objects of experience, then eventually what you will be left with is something which is inexpressible. And that process, right? So I cannot communicate the truth directly. What I can do is I can get people to engage in that process, basically, and then through their own efforts, what happens is, it's not, the truth is basically appears to be obscured by what are essentially called attachments to a certain kind of identity, and the desires and fears that flow from that identity, and that reinforce that identity. So it's kind of a cycle, desires, fear, identities are all part of the same thing. And so by turning the attention inward, what happens is that the mind starts to encounter an inner peace. And the inner peace draws the mind systematically away from these attachments, because why would I go and deal with the pains of the world when I can just find inner peace by looking within? So this inner peace is not the ultimate inner peace, yes, it's just a relative inner peace, right? You start to concentrate the mind inward, and in the process you're like, oh, actually there's something here that's blissful, that and that process then snowballs, right? Because then you want more and more and more peace inward, and less looking for stuff outward. And that starts to weaken the attachments, weaken the habits, weaken the identity. And those are the obstructions to clear seeing, basically, because one can be told, one is the self. Actually, that's really all you need to hear. If your mind is very, very pure, those words will prompt you to look inward, and that one look will be sufficient in a very, very pure mind. What does a pure mind mean? A pure mind mind is one that is has very, very weak or few attachments, basically, and so is relatively still. So the process is basically, turn the mind inward, start to encounter inner peace, want more of that inner peace, right? Detach from the external things more and more and more, and then the mind goes further and further and further and deeper and deeper and deeper into that. And eventually, when the attachments and obstructions are sufficiently weakened, there's clarity. And then there could be sort of in between things, right? There could be moments of clarity, what I call glimpses, essentially, moments of clarity. But then the mind is drawn back because of remaining attachments. But those moments of clarity have nevertheless weakened the attachments further. And then you do it again and again and again and again until the attachments are eventually, break. Basically, the critical mass of it has to be broken, and then clarity automatically arises, basically.
Wow. Yeah. Easier said than done, huh?
Easier said than done.
Yeah. It seems like that's the whole point of this quote unquote spiritual journey, is to, putting it very simply, is just to detach ourselves from the outside world that we think is going to make us happy or make us pure or, show us who we are, but it's not. It's not. You're not going to find that from the outside world whatsoever. The only way is within. It's the hardest part is walking the path, doing the work, I guess you could say.
Yes.
Staying disciplined in that.
Yes, 100% agree. Exactly. That's exactly right. And it's a great pleasure to do it. It's the truth, right? And the reality is people think the world is pleasurable and that the spiritual path is in a way about giving up pleasure. But the reality is actually that the pleasure of the outside world is just a reflection of the pleasure of the self. That's it. And so, and strictly speaking, inferior to it. And bliss, there is a reason that the self is called bliss. It's not exactly and precisely, it's not exactly the same as the bliss of the outside world, because the bliss of the outside world is marked by a contrast between pain and pleasure, whereas the bliss of the self is continuous. But but it is called bliss for a reason. And so the Buddha talked about people think the world is pleasurable, but it's really the kind of pleasure that you get from touching a red hot iron bar and then letting go. It's like it's the pleasure of briefly stopping pain, basically. And so good. So it's that can be difficult for people to let go of, but they have to realize that the practice itself is actually quite is in a way it's the point. The state of concentration that you achieve is pleasurable. The reason I'm putting it this way is the point is it's not just all eating your vegetables. You're really feasting on the honey inside. Actually, is what you're trying to do. It is difficult, but it's difficult only because of the habits that have attached people to pain. Yeah.
Do you think that's kind of, for lack of better words, why we're here in this incarnation? Kind of to, like, the game of life is one of detaching ourselves from the outside, our outside aspect of ourselves, and then really finding out what we are, like really finding out what it means to be a human being beyond this meat suit, beyond the attachments of the meat suit, like really what it is to just simply be a conscious being, whatever that means. Do you think that's kind of what the truth is, the best way that we can describe it?
Well, so when you just said, I think your initial way of phrasing was like, oh, this is like the purpose of this incarnation, right? Is that you're sort of getting at?
Yeah, pretty much.
So it's tricky to answer that because I would say I would say it depends. It depends on what we mean by that. Like there's a story. I think every purpose itself is a concept. Okay, is itself a concept that's sort of built on, you might say, egoic foundations. And what the purpose of things is in a way it's a human way of looking at it. Uh, you know, Reality might be beyond purpose as we understand purpose. And different people might have different purposes. The reality is, incarnation. People are all doing different things, and what they're doing in a way is what they can't help but do. Everyone is caught in the machines of in God's machine, and God is directing them as God wills, basically. So it might turn out for the spiritual aspirant, for them their purpose is this. For other people, their purpose might be something else, and the reality is all the self, actually. And at a deeper level, really, so Vedanta, and I would say this is in a way, there's an element of this is the deeper truth that the idea that there's manifestation at all is questionable. So it's not precisely that there's nothing, but the moment you say there is something, now you've entered, you might say, the egoic position, because now you're asserting that there is an experiencer, and the ego is the idea that there is an experiencer, there's a doer, right? And so if you say there is manifestation, and then we're talking about the purpose of this manifestation is like something like, to find our real nature, or something like that, it's a way of putting it. It's not, I won't say exactly it's wrong, but I would just note that it's still, it makes a lot of assumptions. It makes a lot of assumptions about what's really going on, basically. And I would suggest that ultimately the truth is outside of assumptions.
Mm-hmm.
So we can debate like, oh yeah, as soon as we're in the egoic viewpoint and we're talking about what's happening, then it can be very fun to speculate about what's going on, why. But you really can't won't be able to ever come to any conclusions on that point, because once you've stated that there is something happening, now you've entered the labyrinth of the ego, and
Okay.
there is no escape from the labyrinth of the ego, because the first step already dooms you. What we want is to recognize what the real escape is I've never entered it. I've never entered. Meaning that who is it that says that there is anything going on here? That's the actual non-dual inquiry, right? Who is it that says that there's an incarnation, right? Who is it that says that I'm here to do something, or there's anything going on, right? Actually, that's we don't know the answer to that question, right? Until we look. So that's that'd be downside. There's many different ways of saying, like, why is the world here? But is the world here? I would say is a more interesting question, because ultimately, no explanation in words of what the purpose of the world is going to be that satisfying, because you can't prove it.
Yeah.
You can't prove it, and we don't have access to God's mind. And so if we assert that there is manifestation and stuff happening, and we want to know why, then all we can say is, well, God knows, but we don't. We're mortals, But the exit from the problem is to look at it, to want to examine who it is that believes that anything's happening. That's how you sort of transcend that issue. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Definitely. Yeah, it makes sense to the best that we can convey it with words. Yeah, that makes sense. So the truth lies in self-inquiry, right? Is kind of what I'm getting. What is the process, or at least your process, of self-inquiry, if you could put it simply?
Sure. So the way I explain self-inquiry is that you have a very basic, mundane, sense of being here right now. Like, I'm here, I'm listening to this conversation, I'm looking around, I have perceptions, thoughts, feelings, right? I am seeming to be the witness of all of this. and we kind of understand what like perceptions are. Like perceptions come through our vision and our hearing and whatnot, and we have this. We can sort of like point to what a thought is in a way or a feeling, right? Like, oh yeah, there are like these sort of sensations of a sort, but we also have simultaneously with all of these have this knowledge that I exist as a witness to these things. Self-inquiry is trying to say, okay, turn your attention towards that I, which is coming into your own experience. Like what exactly is it? Like look in your own experience and try to examine what it is. And the cardinal rule of inquiry is if you can experience it, then that isn't the I. That's the cardinal rule. Now that may not be the rule ultimately in the end game, but it's the rule for the moment. So when you do inquiry, what you're doing. So for example, right? So just to give you an actual example of how this works, you might say you might turn inward and try to examine the I. What is it? Where is it coming from? I mean, and even these questions like what is it? Where is it coming from? Are just prompts. You don't actually need the questions. What there is the experience of the I that you're having, because when you, for example, like, I don't know, you look at the screen in front of you, there are two things that are happening. One is you see the screen in front of you, but simultaneous with that, you also know I'm aware of the screen and I am not the screen. That is to say, there's a distance between me and the screen. If there weren't a distance between me and the screen, I wouldn't be able to see the screen as a separate object. The screen is only perceptible because I am apart from it, looking at it, not it. So what is this I that is not the screen? What is this I that is not the perceptions? What is this I that is not the thoughts, not the feelings, but it's right here. It's right here. I'm experiencing it continuously. Turn your attention towards that. And so someone might say, okay, well, if I turn my attention towards that, I feel it to be, let's say, somewhere in my head or something like that. Some people might say that, for example. And then if you apply the sort of cardinal rule of inquiry and you say, okay, well, you've turned your attention towards the I and you think it's somewhere in your head. Are you aware of this sensation somewhere in your head? And of course, they're going to have to respond, yes, I am. So if you're aware of it, then clearly it cannot be the I, because I am aware of this sensation in my head, right? So it can't be the I, it's another object, basically. And so then you just repeat that, right? I mean, you can view it one of two ways at that point. You can say, well, who's aware of that? That's one way of looking at it. Or you could just repeat. You can say, well, where is the I, period? It doesn't really matter whether you, quote unquote, peel back layers or you just repeat the inquiry from the beginning. These are all, it doesn't matter. But what matters is that you return and attempt to hunt down this very obvious thing, right? This I is not some abstract conception in the distance. It's not like looking for God or looking for some weird thing that we've heard about, like the self with a capital S. We're not looking for something which we've heard about. We're looking for something which is right here, which we are literally experiencing right now in every moment. It's the immediate obvious thing, but then it's remarkably elusive as soon as we start looking for it, because we're looking for the subject, which experiences all the objects, but all we find is a series of objects. But that's not the conclusion. So we can't just say, oh, it's impossible, because that's another thing people come to. Like, it's impossible, it's a futile, impasse, dead end. No, because even at the dead end, who is aware of the dead end? Who is aware of the impasse? Who is aware of the inability to get anywhere? You right there. You're right there experiencing it all. So what appears to be a dead end is essentially it's a false dead end, and it what really is there is it's that you're held back from the realization by your attachments. So by continuously engaging in the attempt at the inquiry, even if you don't feel like you can go forward, but continuously trying to reorient yourself towards the I, it's really kind of a process of like you can't actually grasp it, right? You're unable to. I mean, there is a kind of grasping at the end once there's clarity, but for most seekers, most of the time, it's going to be this feeling of frustration of various kinds. But by staying with that and reorienting yourself over and over and over and over and over again to that I, chasing it through the series of objects that your mind goes through and saying, well, who's aware of this? 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 Right? That's what's going to weaken the attachments, because you're going to start concentrating on the inquiry, and the concentration of the inquiry will itself bring about a certain inner peace. And that inner peace, like I said, is what's going to weaken the attachments. Also, so inner peace weakens the attachments. The other part that weakens the attachments in inquiry is, why is it that you care about the world, right? Like anything in the world matters to you because it feels like I am involved, right? Like my career, my family, my relationships, my future that I'm going to deal with tomorrow and whatnot. But if you stop for a second and say, well, yeah, but who exactly is this I that I'm talking about? Like suddenly you're stopped short because you're not quite sure what that is. Like, yeah, I'm me, aren't I? Like that's how it goes, right? You just take it for granted that you kind of know what that is, but you don't actually know what it is. Yeah. Again, in your own experience, like you're experiencing it, but you don't. But then if you actually look at what that experience is, like, I don't actually know what this is. I thought I knew, but I don't. And so when that occurs to you, that tends to throw kind of like a wedge in the sort of wheel of interest in the world, because it's sort of be like you have a work meeting in an hour or something like that, and you go to the bathroom to, like, I don't know, wash up or something like that, and you look in the mirror and you suddenly realize that the face that stares back at you is not your own. Like somebody else's face. How important would that work meeting then be? Right? Like, yeah. Not very important. Be like, what is going on? Right? You'd be like, am I going insane? What's happening? Right? So if you actually take the inquiry question seriously, it's kind of pointing to that. It's like, oh my God, I actually literally, not figurative, literally don't know who I am. So what does it matter? Any of these things, everything would grind to a halt, really, if you take it very seriously, until I know who I am. Like so that's the other way it sort of, stops the attachments from working over time, basically. Well, so that's how inquiry works, basically. So you pursue this refocus on the I.
That's what Ramana Maharshi was. That's what he was pretty much preaching.
Yeah, I mean, so I would say he preached two things, which are very related and almost the same. So one is inquiry, and the other is surrender. So surrender is it's seemingly different, but actually more or less the same. So what surrender is, so inquiry is this sort of, it's and different people are sort of drawn to these different methods in different proportions, I would say. But inquiry is sort of presents this kind of riddle in a way, because here's something that's really obvious, but when I look for it, it's gone. Here's something that I'm experiencing continuously, but I can't seem to find it.
That's funny. I was watching your videos and I was like, the way you put it, I thought in my head, I was like, these are like riddles. So it's funny that you use that word.
yes, very much so. It is a riddle, and that's why you have the idea like in like Zen and stuff like that. Like a koan, the koan is that kind of riddle. It's precisely a riddle like that. Surrender is a different approach. Surrender is it's less of the riddle flavor and more of so basically I teach surrender is ignore all thought and relax. Okay. And by the way, so surrender and self-inquiry per Maharishi's instructions are to be done continuously. They're not methods of sitting meditation. You can do them sitting if you want, but they're not really about, I'm going to do them for an hour in the morning and an hour in the evening. They're about doing these methods continuously, or as close to that as possible. I mean, it's not going to fail probably initially if you try it like that, but that's okay. Like, you fail and you keep trying and to get better at it. But anyway, so surrender is, the way I teach it is ignore all thought and relax. And what does that mean? So ignore all thought would be something like, imagine there's a TV in the corner and the TV is playing and everything that's going on is on the TV. You don't have to turn the TV off. So you don't have to stop thought. You don't have to kick thought out. You don't have to even change the channel. And you don't have to notice everything that's on the TV. You just have to ignore the TV. Whatever the TV is saying, just don't pay attention to it as best you can. It'll still be going on in the background in some way, but you're not going to let your foreground attention go to it. That's what ignoring all thought is. And relaxing means, and these are really almost the same thing, really, but relaxing just means, does not mean you have to feel relaxed. You do not have to feel relaxed. You could feel relaxed, but you don't have to feel relaxed. Relax just means that you don't put in voluntary effort. You don't put in deliberate voluntary effort towards anything except the surrender process itself. So in surrender, what you're doing is you are deliberately ignoring. I could say all thought, or I could really literally say everything, because these are the same thing, actually. So ignore all thought or ignore everything and relax and just keep that going. Ignore everything except the process of surrender itself. And so the process of surrender is a continuous ignoring and ignoring and ignoring and ignoring. And also that, so there's different ways of looking at this, but I'll bring up a couple points. One is that when you're ignoring, it's never that you come to a point when there's nothing left to ignore. There's always more to ignore. Even when you've ignored one thing, another thing is there. You take one thing away and there's something that remains. Well, now ignore that, and then ignore that, and then ignore that. And even if you come to a so-called silence, you're noticing the silence. So if it's a notice, now it's a thought. So ignore that. So ignore even the silence. Ignore even the silence. So you want to keep ignoring and ignoring and ignoring. Now, these seem superficially different, right? Inquiry and surrender seem superficially different. Inquiry is actively looking and trying to solve the riddle of the self, the I in particular, and surrender is kind of seemingly more like passive, quote unquote. So it seems. Actually, it's not really passive. There's intense concentration that's required to ignore everything and relax. But what's happening is with inquiry, when you plunge into the I, what are you doing to the objects of the world?
Well, surrendering.
You're surrendering, exactly. You're ignoring them because precisely, yeah, you're ignoring them, exactly. So you are, you are essentially surrendering them precisely. And similarly, when you're surrendering and you're ignoring everything and relaxing, where is your attention backing into?
Myself, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's right. Precisely. Essentially, yeah, exactly. The subject, the I, because when you're ignoring the objects, there's only one place you can go, which is the subject. So really inquiry is you're going forward into the I, and surrender is quote unquote you're backing into the I. They're really exactly the same thing, just slightly different flavors. Some people find one or the other more amenable, but the process is basically the same. Ignore the objects of the world and discern away, finer and finer, subtler and subtler layers of that, basically. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And again, eventually clarity is reached when the attachments are sufficiently weakened. Great. It's almost, they're exactly the same thing. When the attachments are weakened, clarity increases. These are, basically linked. And when clarity increases, attachments decrease.
Wow. That's is that would you say this is the way to peace? This is how we kind of become, I don't even say happy, but like you said,
yes.
you purify the mind and reach that state, that blissful state that we all are naturally.
Yes. Exactly. That's exactly right. So I think you kind of touched on it a second ago when you said, you wouldn't, not exactly happy. I think you're exactly correct, because, there's a little bit of a, difficult thing for the mind to digest here, which is that we're going through inquiry and surrender you get to an increasingly peaceful mind, an increasingly still mind, and an increasingly quiet mind, an increasingly detached mind. But that's not the end of the process. The end of the process has to ultimately culminate in an insight, essentially, that one is not defined by mental states at all. So it's insufficient to merely have a peaceful mind. That's very good, but it's insufficient. It's very important to have that in order to get the insight. But but even however peaceful a mind you may have, it's nevertheless going to occasionally be interrupted. And so what we're trying to get to do is to go from the peaceful mind to, through surrender, this happens automatically through surrender and inquiry, this final piece, but to the recognition of that we aren't defined by states of mind at all. That we aren't defined by states of mind at all. That even when the mind, technically speaking, even when the mind is depressed, even when it's anxious, even when it's fearful, encountering all these negative emotions, what we really are, is not affected by any of those things, not even for a second, not even for a second. And the bliss of the self runs continuously throughout all those states. So in order to get that insight, we have to go through this process, however. But the end of that process will be actually that, in fact, we were that all the time, and this entire process has been, in some sense, fictional, and the effort we put in as seekers was also fictional. And in fact, even the recognition, even enlightenment itself, is in some sense fictional. So all of that comes at the end. But the spiritual seeker has to maintain what I call sort of the seeker's paradox, which is, I'm already that, and yet I have to put in effort. Both of these have to be maintained simultaneously.
Oh. That's heavy stuff, man. That's heavy stuff for the mind,
Yeah, it is. But it is the path. It is the path to bliss. Absolutely, it's the path to celestial bliss. That's what we're all looking for, and that's what's there. It's also the path to the end of, to that sort of, at least the bite that the existential questions have on us, like what's the point of it all, and why is there anything, and all that sort of thing. It's not precisely that those questions are given verbal answers, but like that sort of like the pain associated with those questions goes away, because there is a deeper understanding that can't be put into words about how those questions are themselves, in some sense, based on a incorrect assumption, basically. Yeah.
Wow. So do you have a personal practice, like something that you do on a regular basis, or is it just like do you have like a meditation practice, a yoga practice, or anything? Or you just
No,
teach?
not really. No, I mean, not really. No, because the ultimate point of all of this is to get beyond practice, right? We practice so that we're no longer dependent upon a practice. I mean, I do, I do, sit for 5 minutes in the morning, just out of habit, and there might be occasional thoughts of surrender or something like that come up. But the reality is that those are irrelevant in the end. In the end, what we're trying to get to is a clarity, which is no longer dependent upon practice, or alternatively, where the mind is so, you can view it different ways, but where the mind is so, has developed such a new way of being that has now become so habitual that it no longer feels like you're doing anything. It becomes entirely automatic, and so that's another way of looking at it. There's different ways of looking at it, but we're doing practice so that we get past practice in the end. That's the goal. We don't want to be dependent on practice.
I see. That's like the seeker's paradox, like you said, the spiritual paradox.
Yeah, because right. You seek, there is an end to the seeking. There's a finding of sorts. It's just not what you think it is, but there is a finding of sorts. And that finding is liberation from effort, and that includes the effort of spiritual seeking. So we don't seek forever. We seek until the attachments are destroyed, basically.
So what if I ask you, what is God? How would you describe that? I know you can't put it in the words, but if you can, to the best of your ability.
Yeah, see, God is what is when the mind is suspended.
Mm, that's good. That's a good answer. I
Yeah.
like that.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean,
Mm,
that's, uh, that's, and when the mind isn't suspended, God continues to be there. So it's, but that's really what it is, right?
God is.
God is, and frankly, God is not too. God is beyond is and is not. God is
Mm,
beyond all the. God is what's beyond all the dichotomies. Beyond is and is not, beyond even beyond pleasure and pain, beyond truth and untruth, beyond the three states of awareness. And God is obviously also uh, the self.
mm,
Not God is what we actually are, stripped of the misconceptions about what we are. What we actually are is that.
mm-hmm.
Yeah, and the misconceptions don't even exist actually. So, but that's what God is.
Hmm. Good answer, man. That was good.
Yeah,
Did you? I heard you say like the three. What was it? The three stages of awareness or something like that.
I mean, this is a classical Vedantic idea. Right? I mean, waking, dreaming, and deep sleep. These are the three states of consciousness. This is
Oh.
and so the idea is right. Individual existence. That is the sense that you're an individual person. It only really manifests in the waking and dreaming states, right? Like you have this sense of like self-consciousness, like, oh yeah, I'm here. That sense is only there in the waking and dreaming states. In deep sleep, um, there's no reflection because there's no objects. But that doesn't
Mm,
mean that you don't exist. It's just that you don't know that you exist in the same way. But here's the thing, right? So deep sleep, from our waking standpoint, deep sleep, deep dreamless sleep, seems like unawareness, like we're just unaware. Um, but actually, the truth is, it's not exactly that. It's more like we're aware of nothing.
mm.
In other words, the
Oh
reason I
yeah.
bring this up is in a way the whole spiritual search is seeing that uh, the kind of awareness that we have in the waking state, which is self consciousness, is not actually us. That's just a thought. So the waking state of consciousness, which feels like I'm a separate person, is a reflection. That's the ego, you might say. And what we actually are is that within which that floats.
Mm.
So we are even in deep dreamless sleep, but but
Not aware
just
that we are.
we are not aware in the same way that we are. That's right. We're not
Okay.
aware in a reflective way that we are. And so
Mm.
discerning the fact that I am not this shiny sense of self-consciousness, that I'm not that. If you really can see that clearly, then you'll simultaneously recognize, in some sense, what you actually are.
Mm.
But it's
Wow.
very hard to see that because self-consciousness is very, very subtle. It's very subtle. So you have to strip away all the adjuncts that kind of that are attached to it, and then the sort of very thin piece of like scotch tape or something like that is what remains. It's transparent, and then it doesn't even not even that then remains. But yeah, that's the reason I bring that up is because in a way uh, God and the self are beyond all the possible qualities or properties you can give to it, including what we normally think of as awareness.
Mm-hmm.
Awareness, what we normally think of is self-awareness, awareness. It's awareness in the waking state. That's only one kind of awareness. And so the actual awareness with a capital A has to include both what we consider awareness and what we consider unawareness. It includes them both. It's
Mm-hmm.
true of being and non-being. It's true of truth and untruth, and all these other things. Where even bliss, right? So the bliss of the self, it is bliss, but it's not exactly bliss in the way we normally think of it. It's not like the bliss of eating chocolate cake precisely, although that's not unrelated. The bliss of the self has to be there even when you're experiencing pain. So when you're suffering,
Mm.
it's still blissful in some sense. Well, how does that work? Well, the best analogy I can give to it is, which I often give, is you're watching a really sad movie, let's say, about something horrible happening to people, and even though you're experiencing negative emotions, when you watch this movie, you could still admire the artistry with which it's created. Like it's well acted, it's well directed, it's well written, it's well produced, right? The beautiful cinematography, right? The craftsmanship of it is there, even in and through the sadness. So there's an aesthetic bliss.
Mm.
So
Aesthetic bliss. Yeah,
yeah,
that's
aesthetic
good.
bliss. That's really what's going on here, right? So the bliss of the self is it includes what we would consider states of unbliss and unhappiness. Even the unhappiness is in some sense blissful because you are even during the state of unbliss. So we have to be careful with these words. The self is defined in these ways. Classic definition again in Vedanta is Satchidananda, which means being, awareness, bliss. But each of those words doesn't quite mean what we think it means in the usual context. It includes its opposite, right? The being of the self includes non-being. The awareness of the self includes what we consider unawareness, which is like, for example, deep sleep, and the bliss of the self includes what we consider pain, for example, which is the bliss that we experience even when we're having negative emotions.
Mm. Yeah. Wow. It seems like a dwelling in this state of thought process seems to be a way of working with the paradox of the polarities of the mind. It's like dwelling somewhere in the middle of the paradox of the yin and yang of the world that we find ourselves in. Does that make sense?
Sorry, could you elaborate a little bit? So when you say using the mind, you mean like like uh like in a negative way? You mean like when the mind is sort of engaged in itself and not looking, not engage in any kind of practice, or what do you mean specifically? Sorry, can you
Yeah,
elaborate?
it seems like this path of self inquiry is navigating between the polarities of the mind, of the how do I explain it, like what you just described as like feeling bliss in a non-blissful state, but you can still be feel bliss, or maybe using a different word for bliss, I don't know, peace. um it's being able to like go with the flow. It's being able to ride the waves, like the ups and the downs of this crazy experience that we find ourselves in. It seems like it's the middle way. It seems like somewhere, just dwelling somewhere in the middle of not being too attached to our mind and not being too attached to being unattached, if that makes sense. There's it's just somewhere in the middle. There's peace somewhere in the middle of all of that.
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting way of putting it. I think yeah, I mean I'm tempted to partly agree with you, but I'm also tempted to slightly disagree because I think I think
Please
I
do.
think I think what seems like the middle is actually in some sense um transcendent of, because the opposites, right? Like, we want to exit the situation where we have to navigate, basically, like we want to exit the situation where we have to, or we're trying to sort of surf, right? Surfing is for a while, but eventually the reason we surf is so that we can exit the whole idea of surfing.
Mm-hmm.
The reality is the entire picture is happening on a canvas and the canvas is still, or the movie is
Mm.
happening on a screen. I mean, it's not a perfect analogy. Again, it's a actually there is no screen really, but 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 there is a stillness even during the motion is the point. So
Yeah.
that's the real stillness, which we are basically.
Mm.
So these different polarities, I would say that the way it goes is we move away from the changing and we do come to the unchanging, but the unchanging, or the relatively unchanging. And the relatively unchanging, which is the detached, you're right that that's not the end point. That also has to be detached from, which is absolutely correct. But really, that that move, um, in some sense, reveals that we were not in this game, And so first you come from, I think again a Buddhist concept, from the many things to the one thing. We are trying to get through inquiry and surrender. We're trying to get through the mind from focusing on many different things to concentrating on one thought.
Mm-hmm.
But then from that one thought, it goes to quote unquote no thought, which really just means that we're playing a different game altogether.
Oh, I
you
see.
know and you're right, that we're not, we don't want to be attached to detachment. But what I want to emphasize is that the ultimate clarity gets us out of the sense that we're playing a game, because we're no longer playing a game, because we're not in the game. We're not, that uh, that's what winning the game is, so to say, is recognizing that we're not playing.
Oh.
We're not playing. So there's no surfing, there's no navigating in some sense, because we're not in the movie. We're sitting in, and even as I say it, I'm like, these metaphors are all problematic. But like, we're quote unquote not in the movie. We are quote unquote sitting in the theater, and so we're not playing the game. We're not playing. We're never playing the game, actually. And that sense of there being something which is not in the framework of the mind. There's something not, all the polarities back and forth are mental.
Mm.
We're trying to not navigate between the polarities, but escape polarity entirely. And luckily, we can do that because we're not actually in the polarity at all to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
So there's something, we are, and frankly, the path to it is we actually, the path to that is not actually navigating between the polarities. It's going very sharply towards one side first, right? So first, we're caught in the world. Then we go very, very sharply towards detachment. Very sharply toward. We don't try to mix. We don't try to balance them. We're trying to be totally detached. And through our attempt to be totally detached through inquiry and surrender, then there's clarity that goes beyond even detachment, because then
Mm.
there's something which is, because even detachment is not perfect.
Mm-hmm.
So you want something which is perfect, and that perfection is what we are. That perfection is achieved through the destruction of the weakening of the attachments, but it goes beyond them. And then it doesn't really matter. Then you've exited the game. But the point is that it's yeah. I don't know if that made any sense. Then the middle way, I do think there's the which kind of alluded to. I do think is relevant in one sense, which is that as a spiritual seeker, to the best of your abilities, what you want to do is you're trying to create conditions where your mind gets quieter. Now, a quiet mind is not the end of the process, but a quiet mind is very critical to the process. And so why, for example, do all the different spiritual paths say things like be a moral person, be honest, don't don't sleep too much or sleep too little, eat too much or eat too little. These are all middle path kind of ideas. And the answer is because if you go to extremes in your way of life, what tends to happen, not always the case, but tends to happen, is your mind becomes more agitated. And so when there's more agitation, it's harder to see the truth, basically. The truth is clearly seen in the quiet mind, basically. And so in that sense, I would say there's a middle path. But basically though, it's sharply veering towards attachment first.
Mm-hmm.
Then detachment frees you from having to think about things in terms of detachment. But we're trying to, people always ask, like, for example, how are you supposed to do surrender or self-inquiry when you're doing other things? How do you balance it with real life? Well, the answer is you don't try to balance it with real life. You let the mind and the body try to deal with real life by themselves, right? You're not the mind and the body, actually. That's what self-inquiry and surrender are trying to point out. You do self-inquiry and surrender as best you can. This is the hard part. And don't worry about what happens in your life. Let your life take care of itself. Because in fact, that's what's already happening. Your life is already taking care of itself. You're not actually participating. You don't actually have any control over what's happening, though it seems like you do. We're trying to turn our attention wholeheartedly and 100% to the detachment processes of inquiry and surrender, you know, and not trying to balance them in any way with anything else. Let life and the mind and the body deal with themselves. And then through that, then there's liberation even from that effort at detachment.
Mm. Wow, this is a great conversation so far. I'm digging this.
I'm glad you like it.
Yeah, you're a unique individual, that's for sure. Man, do you think the world is ready for this at this point? Like, how are we 7.5 billion people? How are we all gonna get on the same page?
Well, then we're not. That's very simply put, we're not, right? Because you know, it's only those who are to whom this strikes a bell, you know, rings a bell, basically, that will be attracted to this. You know, you could tell most people about this stuff, and you know, they would have no interest in it, even if they didn't think you were crazy. It just wouldn't mean anything to them. They'd be indifferent to it, and it's like, be like, okay, whatever. That's how most people would react, right? So it's not the case that 7.5 billion people will be doing this. And frankly, it's not going to happen that way, and it doesn't really matter that it happens that way. It's really not. You know, how do I put this? It's not our purpose to force everyone into enlightenment or anything like that. The reality is, everyone, you know, all these seeming people who are doing seemingly different things are in fact nothing but the self, right? The reality is nobody is actually suffering, you know, which is a shocking thing to say, but it's the truth. You know, the truth is the self alone is, and everything else is illusion. You know, and so all we can do is, and frankly, it's not even a choice. The truth is, spiritual seekers are spiritual seekers because the same forces that control the universe force them to be spiritual seekers, basically. Mm-hmm. And so they have no choice over it any more than anyone else has any choice not to be a spiritual seeker. Mm-hmm. But they're forced to look inwards, and when they do look inwards, eventually it comes to the recognition that there is only the unlimited peace, and all the idea that there was a person who was suffering, was a seeker, and who then was a finder, and all of that is just fictional. Mm-hmm. And that's true then for all the other 7 billion people who are not doing this. They're just as much fictional. The seekers and the non-seekers, they're all, in as much as you consider them to be separate individuals, that's fiction, you know, all the way through. And so it's not our role. We neither have the responsibility and certainly not the power to compel anybody to take this up. You know, people who are attracted to it will come to it, and those who are not attracted to it, you know, you could shove it down their throats and it wouldn't mean anything to them. You know, it wouldn't have any effect. You know, so they won't be able to hear. And you have that notion in multiple scriptures. You know, you have that in the New Testament. Jesus says, those who have ears to hear, let them hear. And he says it's going to be a minority of people. You know, you might be talking to 100 people. He says, of which there might be only a small fraction that will actually get at what he's driving at. You know, and in the Bhagavad Gita, it said that, you know, of the many thousands of people that, you know, in many thousands of people, there might be a single person in many thousands who might even be interested in the spiritual path. You know, who might even be interested. Most of them are not even interested. And then of the people who are interested, you know, of many thousands of those people, right? Only very few are going to really get to the heart of it. Now, that's true in any particular lifetime. I think the other facet of it is, which is the sort of hopeful message for seekers, is once you start down the path, you know, if we go by scripture, and this is said in a lot of different scriptures, not just Hindu scripture, Buddhist scripture as well, you know, that you're starting down a path where your eventual success is guaranteed. It may not be in this lifetime, it may be lifetimes from now, but if you don't get to the ultimate goal in this lifetime, then it is said in the Bhagavad Gita, for example, you will be reborn, even though rebirth is a provisional concept that's not really true, but you will be reborn, and you will pick up where you left off. And so that's one optimistic way of viewing it for everybody. You could say, oh, all 7.5 billion people, they may not get it now, but somewhere down the line of the infinite number of births we have, they'll pick it up. Who knows? Maybe that's true. Maybe that's not true. The whole way of looking at it is problematic. But it depends on who you ask. These become very speculative. There's a story somewhere in Hindu scripture that says something like, okay, you have so many countless births, and maybe you start out as some kind of insect or bacteria or something like that, and you grow into a human being eventually over millions or billions or trillions of births, and then as a human being you eventually visit the heavens and become like a kind of angel or demigod eventually, and eventually you gain all these special powers, and you gain the power to travel the entire universe and to see everything that's in it and to experience everything there is to be experienced. And at the end of these countless births, having experienced all that the universes have to give you, you might say then, is that all there is? And at that point, that's when the spiritual quest then begins. So there's different takes on it, but so because the idea is that no matter what there is, it's not going to be enough. No matter how many universes there are, it's not going to be enough, because they're all limited. And so that's another way of looking at it, about what goes on. There's different ways, and as soon as you look at it in a certain way, which means you're engaging in philosophy and speculation, there's only going to be different viewpoints, and there's not going to be any way to decide the truth of the matter, because if there is a truth of the matter, it's certainly not available to our mortal minds in that form. It's not going to be an idea that we can think like, oh yeah, like this is what happens over the many lives. This is the exact sequence of events. I very much suspect, if God's mind, is what's creating things, if we want to view it like that, God's mind does not work in a way that human minds can grasp in that form. You know what I mean? Like it must work in some very different way, if we want to view it that way. But the reality is, right? So there's two ways of looking at these things, right? So if you ask a question about like how things are, you're going to be doomed to philosophical speculation with no end, which can be fun, but will not come to a conclusion, and we'll have to end up by saying it's a mystery to us mortals. Maybe God knows. And the other way is to look into who asks the question. And if you look into who asks the question, then there is a dissolution of the question into peace. So in some sense, you would say, there was no verbal answer to my question. I asked how things worked, and I didn't get an answer. I didn't get like the Wikipedia article on how the universe really works. But there was nevertheless a recognition that even the idea, this question about how the universe works, is itself based on incorrect view. It's not really, the idea of a universe, the idea of working, all of those things are themselves based on the assumption that I'm here as a separate experiencing, doing individual. All the concepts are built on the egoic assumption. They're all built on that, because it's only if I'm in here, separate from the out there, that I can name the world. I'm in here, separate from the out there, and then I impose boundaries on the out there. The out there, the not me, I impose name and form and boundary, and then I can have concepts built on that. But if I look inside and say, well, but what is this I that's supposedly at the center and it's different from the outside? And if that then turns out, oh, shoot, this is not what it seems to be, then the distance that I've carefully constructed between me and the outside world, and upon which all my concepts are built, breaks down. The name and form that governs them breaks down. And that means the concepts which come from them break down. Language breaks down. And that means the questions like, how does the universe work, break down. So it's a big black hole that sucks all of that into it,
Mm.
and that's the other way of going about it.
Wow. The black hole of self-inquiry.
That's right.
Wow, that was great, man. I think we can probably wrap the convo up at that point. That's a great point to wrap it up at. Do you have anything that you'd like to plug? Anything you'd like to say before we wrap it up?
Not really. No. I mean, I guess you know, as I said, I mean, I work with people in one on one. I feel like I should do group work. So if anyone feels like they would work well with me on a one on one situation, feel free to contact me. And other than that, watch my videos, read my books. I'm that's pretty much about what I would say. And can't think of anything else really. But thank you so much for this very very wonderful and open conversation, and for the opportunity to air my thoughts on various things. I
Of
really
course.
appreciate it.
Of course, man. Thanks for coming on and talking to me. This was a profound conversation. I think I'm gonna go take a walk in the woods and just reflect for a little bit after this one. These are some heavy topics, but I like it.
Yeah,
I like going to the depths. The black hole of self inquiry. Thank you
that's
very
right.
much.
Thank you, Gary.
And yeah, hope you have a good day, man.
Oh, you too. Okay, take care.
See you later.